Luke 18, verses 10 through 14. 2 men, he said, went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed in this way to himself: God, I thank you that I am not like the other people, greedy, unjust, immoral, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector stood a long way off and didn't even want to raise his eyes to heaven. He beat his chest and said, God, be merciful to me, sinner that I am. Let me tell you, he was the one who went back to his house vindicated by God, not the other, don't you see? People who exalt themselves will be humbled, and people who humble themselves will be exalted.
Here's an unpopular opinion with some. I love religion. I really do. I love religion. Does that make you feel weird when I say that? There's this spirit in our time, and it comes in a lot of different forms. There's this kind of like anti-religious vibe out there, right? Like, I have some friends who, actually like a decent amount, who would say things like, this is a direct quote from a friend of mine, religion is the greatest perpetrator of violence in the world. Right? Religion is inherently oppressive because anytime you have codes, anytime you have rules, anytime you have any kind of idea of like morality of any kind or a set of practices, it's inherently restrictive. Maybe you don't think of it that way, but in the evangelical world, I heard this so much growing up, that Christianity is a relationship, not a religion. I'm sure you've heard that. There was a really popular video, actually, that went around social media a few years ago. I still see it sometimes. This guy, he's like, really cool. He's like dressed really cool, and he does this spoken word thing about how like Jesus is a relationship, not a religion. Every time I see it, I think of like Leslie Knope on Parks and Rec. She's like slamming beat. Anything can be poetry if you say it like this. That's what I feel like with that guy. You probably also heard things in like broader secular culture like, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, right? Interestingly, though, as of 2012, I think that's the most recent study, 84% of the world considered itself religious, considered itself associated in some way with one of the 5 major world religions. That's a big number, isn't it? 84%. The vast majority of humanity is in some way religious. Is 84% of the world wrong? I'm just kidding. Questions like that are so terrible. Because part of the problem with a question like that, and part of the problem when we have discussions of religion in general, and if it's good or if it's bad or if it's harmful or if it's helpful, is that it's very difficult to even nail down what we mean when we say the word religion. There's no scholarly consensus on what defines religion. Did you know that? There are people who spend their entire lives studying religion, and there's no one consensus on what entails religion. Is it simply cultic practices of a community? Does it entail a belief in a divine power or God of some kind? Even the history of the word is very cloudy. The Latin word religio simply meant to pay veneration to a god. Sometimes it was even used just to simply be the swearing of an oath. When it first came into the English language in the 1200s, it referred to monastic orders. It wasn't anyone who had any kind of piety. The word religion just meant someone who was like actively involved in a monastery. Over the time, like since then, of course, it's come to have this really broad, all-encompassing umbrella. Any attempt to relate to the transcendent, any practice included in that attempt is kind of defined under the word religion. Another issue, right, is that the very idea of studying religion or talking about it in a direct way as distinct from other realms of life is a uniquely modern Western concept. Pre-modern cultures did not have a concept of religion. Many modern, non-Western cultures still don't even have a separate word for the word religion. Because the types of things we might put in that category, right, a sense of the transcendent, cultic practices, beliefs in deities, so forth, are so part and parcel of life, they simply can't be viewed from a place of distance. That's the kind of world in which Jesus lived. Right? Jesus wouldn't have thought about religion as a distinct realm of life like we do. As a first-century Jewish rabbi, Jesus would not have had that conceptual framework in any way. And yet here we are, right? We're not pre-modern. We can't be pre-modern. We probably don't want to be pre-modern. We're Western. We have a distance in the way we talk about religion. We have a choice as to how religious or irreligious we want to be. So what do the stories of Jesus have to speak to us today? How can they speak into our situation when we're so far removed from his situation? Can we actually, with any shred of intellectual integrity, use Jesus to inform our religious lives? I think we can. Because I think most of us are more religious than we may think. And I think that even modern Western societies are more religious than they may think. The scholar Joseph Campbell speaks of religion from a perspective I think is really helpful, right? He says the word religion comes from two Latin words, re, meaning again, right? And legare, to connect. He says religion serves the function of reconnecting people to each other, and reconnecting people to God. And as we look at it from that very broad definition, we see that culture, even secular culture, is very religious. Have you ever been to Washington, D.C.? Many of you have. I know a lot of you because I went on a trip with some of you. As you read inscriptions like around the historical sites, you'll notice that like the language is very lofty. It's very like transcendent. Ideas about the greatness of the human spirit. There's this quote on the outside of the I forget what it's called, the place where like the train comes in, you know, and there's also like a mall there, that place, the station. Anyway, I wanted to get that quote, but I just didn't feel like looking up the picture of it. But whatever, there's this huge like stone relief. It's like massive in these big columns, and the inscription on there is something about like the undying spirit of humanity or something like that. Ideas about the greatness of the human spirit, and particularly its American manifestation, of course. Ideas like freedom for all people. Words like destiny, you'll see that around. And it's all accompanied by massive stone monuments, right? Lofty open spaces that like lift our spirit up past ourselves. And we have practices that go along with that too, don't we? Like holy days, right? 4th of July. And there are a set number of practices you do on that day. Fireworks, right? It's a very like must. Grilling. Who doesn't grill on the 4th of July? We don't think about those as cultic practices because they're so part of our lives, but they really do serve to connect us as individuals, right? Celebration of like who we are as Americans. They connect us to those groups. They connect us as groups of individuals to that transcendent thing, whether it be freedom or the greatness of America or what have you. All cultures do this. It is universal. I think it's inescapable to be religious. So if it's so inescapable then, why do people have such a beef with it? Why do people say religion is bad when everyone's probably religious in the broad sense? And aren't the words bad or evil just moral categories? And aren't moral categories typically bound up with religious ideas? Inescapable. We say religion is bad, though, because it can be. We've all seen it. It can be violent, especially in its national forms. It does oppress people. It allows for terrible, terrible abuses of power in unique and ugly ways. We've seen this, and many of us, many of you, have experienced it firsthand. And this is where the words of Jesus can guide us. Because it may very well be inescapable to be religious, but we can be religious and still be surprised by the kingdom of God. We can still allow for God's new movement even within our religious life. Even more, maybe religion can actually facilitate God's kingdom. I think that's the case. And I think that the parable we just heard read to us speaks directly to these questions and to these concerns and can lead us all to a better place. It has something to say about religion, this parable, doesn't it? It shows two different people in a religious activity, a prayer. And there's two different kinds of prayers. The first is the Pharisee. He prays this kind of like condescending prayer of, thank you, I'm not like all the bad people. I tithe, I fast, amen. The other guy, the tax collector, simply says, God be merciful to me. It's a simple story, but it has some pretty far-reaching implications. First, let's realize this is another parable of reversal. Pharisees are good guys. It's really difficult for us to grasp that now because we've kind of like made them the bad guys. First, there's obviously reasons for this. Like in this story, we see the Pharisee in the position of the bad place. But sometimes we forget that these are parables of reversal. We forget that there's like something intentional Jesus is doing, and we rather take it as just extremely literal. We also see stories in the Gospels of the Pharisees challenging Jesus, and he argues against them, sometimes using really incendiary language towards them. And so all these years later, we kind of just assume that the Pharisees were a bunch of jerks. Right? Do you? That's how I always conceived of it as a child and even into recent years. But we run the risk of not quite understanding what it was that Jesus wanted to confront in the Pharisees. Because so much of our thinking on the Bible, especially the New Testament, has been filtered through the lens of the Reformation. And the debate has been framed by kind of putting Jesus in the position of the Reformers, right? And the Pharisees in the position of the Catholic Church. And so we kind of think the Pharisees were saying, well, if you do good deeds, God will be pleased with you and let you into heaven. And Jesus is like, no, it's not about your good deeds, you legalist. But that's not what was going on. That's not the historical context in Jesus' time. Christian scholarship has tended to be pretty anachronistic over the last 300 or 400 years. But during the last 100 years or so, people started asking, thankfully, who were the Pharisees? Who was Jesus? What is it they actually thought? How did Israel's religious and political life actually function, et cetera, et cetera? You'd be surprised the questions people are asking. Minute. But they're important. Because unless we really understand what it was that Jesus was trying to do, we're going to think he was arguing against something that didn't even exist, and we'll miss the potency of his words for us. When we say someone is Pharisaical today, it's an insult, isn't it? It usually means they're holier than thou, that they're hypocritical, maybe that they say one thing morally and do the other. Or maybe we mean they're imposing too strict a standard, he's Pharisaical because he demands too much of people. They're legalistic. But the Pharisees were really respected in this time, very much so. In fact, religious leaders were respected in general. They guided the community. People would be looking to the Pharisees. Nobody would have had ill will towards them. That's not really a thing. This would have been a very surprising story for them as Jesus spoke it. There's a really interesting fact that I read recently. In all of Middle Eastern Jewish writings, European is a little different because, that then we enter in the priest and the rabbi walk into the bar, right? But in Middle Eastern Judaism, there is not a single writing in all of its history that is derogatory towards a communal religious leader. It simply doesn't exist within their thinking. They're valued, they're looked up to. Why? Because they weren't thieves, because they weren't immoral, because they weren't unjust. All the things he says in his prayer. It's the things that people desire in leaders. And the Pharisees had it. Remember that Paul, too, who, it's not really a stretch to say, founded Christianity as we know it, was himself a Pharisee and was proud of it. If you remember, when he builds his resume, he says, I shouldn't have to say why you should listen to me, but if we're going to play that game, here's my credentials, and he lists among them that he was a Pharisee, and not just any old Pharisee, but a leader among them. You don't include something in your resume that you're embarrassed about. The more that scholarship has learned about Paul, the more we realize that he didn't view himself as like something new, like a new religion, right? But that he was maybe doing what we might call like a reform movement within Judaism. By the way, the Pharisees also didn't think that they were earning God's approval, right? They were sure they already had it. God had made a covenant with Israel. Israel was God's people. We know this. The Torah says it. By this time in Israel's history, when Jesus was alive, there was basically no sense in which God is personally angry at you as an individual and then has to have his mind changed about it. Right? You know, the kind of the modern Christian way of talking about Christianity sometimes is that we're born and God is like already mad because we're born sinners, and so we have to fix it somehow, either in some traditions doing things or in some traditions believing something, but you're born an enemy of God. That's not how Israel would have ever thought about themselves. They were chosen, they were loved, they were blessed. They were living according to Torah so that they could be declared right in the sense of being vindicated. There you go. Everyone got your Amber Alerts? All right. I'll let it settle down. I know that's a very big event. All right. God will vindicate us before our enemies. God will justify us before our enemies. God will rescue us from Rome and will say, you were in the right and they were in the wrong. That is what the word justification means. Vindication, as you heard from the translation Amber read. It's not some kind of like cosmic court scene where God decides like based on your personal morality, but rather a cosmic court scene where he's like, yes, you're my people. I will rescue you from your enemies. I will rule in favor of you and against them. That is justification. And that is what the Pharisees were seeking, to guide the people to be covenantally faithful. So what's Jesus' beef with the Pharisees then? Because he did clearly have one. There's no getting around that. Why would he use them in a parable of reversal? Why put them in the spot of being the bad guys? Why would he include things in this prayer that are actually good things? Do any of you want to be known as a thief? As an adulterer? As a rogue? That's the NRSV's translation of one of those words. I don't even know where that comes from. I'm a rogue. No. He gave his tithe, it said, right? What's the tithe for? It's the portion taken by the temple to give to the poor so that people can live that wouldn't have been able to. They were good things that this guy was doing. Things perhaps that would describe many of you. But then we have a tax collector who definitely would have garnered disrespect and distrust. Remember that Jesus was insulted on more than one occasion by being called someone who hangs out with tax collectors. Like, that was the insult. He hangs out with tax collectors. They don't care about the community like the Pharisees do. They don't care about the well-being of Israel like the Pharisees do. In fact, they personally, financially benefit from the oppression of the people. During the time of Jesus, Rome's taxation was so brutal, so heavy, that the average person lived in poverty. Not just like normal poverty, abject poverty, subsistence style of life. But not tax collectors, because they got a cut of whatever they collected at the expense of their own communities. They were greedy traders. And so, this man calls himself a sinner. Duh, of course he's a sinner, everyone would have said. But then Jesus says he's the one who was vindicated by God and not the Pharisee, and he's exalted. How can that be the case, Jesus? We all know how it works, his hearers would have said. The covenant people are vindicated. God's justification, God's ruling in favor of, comes to the covenant people. And it's our faithfulness to the terms of the covenant that demonstrates to us who it is that's in the right. And Jesus says, you're right. Faithfulness to the covenant is the thing that demonstrates that someone is in the right. And that man who was humble was faithful to the covenant. No, he wasn't, Jesus. He doesn't show any signs of faithfulness. And by the way, the Pharisee has broken covenant. How has he broken covenant? He's followed everything in Torah. He's checked all the boxes. He's upheld the guidelines. There's nothing in this man's life that would be evident of him not being faithful to the covenant. This shows us something about how Jesus thought about the Torah, the law. If it's not the exact following of the points of Torah that makes someone a member of the community of God's people, right? If it's not the following of the Torah that is a sign of good religion, if you will, then what is the Torah even for? It's easy to understand how Jesus got accused of wanting to destroy it, of throw it out, of forsaking it. Because it sounds a little bit like if it's not important in that way, then maybe it's not important at all. But this is where we begin to see the value of religion. Jesus says, no, it's important. I haven't come to destroy Torah. I've come to bring it to all its fullness. What does that mean? Jesus says at the end of the parable, as you heard, that those who are humble will be exalted, and those who are exalted will be humbled. So I think what we can take from this is that Torah was meant to produce humility, to produce an attitude of faith, of openness to God and openness to others. To bring people before God who, yes, certainly is displayed in Torah, but isn't bound to it, isn't fully described in it, exists beyond it. That way of thinking about Torah automatically demands humility, doesn't it? It automatically demands of us that we admit we haven't figured it all out. So then where do we stand with this? Where do we stand as a religious community who doesn't follow Torah, right? Our context is very different than Jesus's. We don't in any way, shape, or form, none of you in this room, think that a sign of a healthy religious life is following Torah. If you do think that, you're failing miserably. But it's a pretty easy connection to make, right? Can you see it? We seek to emulate Jesus, right? We engage in practices like communion, prayer. We sing songs corporately about our connection to God that we found through Jesus. We try to demonstrate that connection through our actions. We engage in acts that seek to serve people around us. We try to provide physical needs. We try to bring food to people who need it. We give our money. We work hard. We get dirty to build a garden with the hope that just maybe someone can have help who needs it in some way. We talk about theology and we discuss ways that we can conceive of God. But the very second that you put all of those into a list and pray, thank you that I'm not like the others, you've entered into bad religion. You've completely lost your way. Because religion is to connect us. But superiority instantly disconnects us from others. Instantly. It builds a wall between ourselves and other people. And what Jesus shows us with this story is that when we disconnect ourselves from others through superiority, we disconnect ourselves from God. We build a wall between ourselves and God. It's a connection that can't be lost, ultimately. I believe that. We talked about it this morning. But we can turn our backs to it. We cover our ears to God when we lose humility. It's a really tough call to hear because humility and the resulting openness to others that flows from it are not celebrated ideas in our culture, like in any way. Building up walls is celebrated on most fronts. Settling into camps is important. So may we have eyes to hear and ears to see. Just know that you don't have to give up your religion. Don't cling to it as a source of security that lets you know you're right and others are wrong, certainly. If you do that, it'll cease to be the beautiful path towards connection and will just become a deadly oppressive force. But recognize it for what it can be. an amazing and beautiful gift that opens us up in ever new ways, that can lift us up to experience the transcendent, to realize our connection to God. May your connections to God and to others grow stronger and stronger. Let's pray. God, we come before you in humility. We understand that there's not some kind of demand that can be made on you for the good of ourselves over and against our enemies. We understand that you are for all of humanity, and not just us. And somehow, strangely, we've realized this through a book, an act, being dunked or sprinkled by water, listening to sermons. As strange as it is, we thank you for these gifts. We thank you for the way our heart has been awakened by them. May you continue to awaken us. Let us not grow stagnant or stale. Do not let our religious acts become oppressive, violent, or give us a sense of superiority. But may they lead us into ever more humility, openness, and love. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. On the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and wine, and he blessed them, and he gave thanks for them. And he told his disciples, "This is my body, which is broken for you. This wine is my blood, which is about to be poured out." To demonstrate covenant faithfulness. It's a strange idea, but it's a good one. Love, the desire for the good of others, all taken to their logical conclusion. And Jesus says, any time from now on that you share this Passover meal, bring that to remembrance. Bring my life, my actions, my teachings back into your hearts, back into your minds, back into your lives. And so now, thousands of years later, outside the Passover context, outside of a meal, we still do this as a way to bring to remembrance again the love of Jesus, the desire he had to bring people around him into a place of love and beauty, the courage he had to challenge structures of domination and violence. We bring that to remembrance. So dwell on these things as we take these together. Take and eat together. Take and drink. Now may God go with you this week. May he give you peace as you bring peace to others. Go in that peace.